And as Neil Oliver and I discussed last night on the show, the revelation by Tory leadership hopeful Rishi Sunak last week that crucial minutes from SAGE meetings during the pandemic were edited to remove opposing views. Has that just exposed the shocking manipulation used by unelected health bureaucrats to lock down innocent folk like you and I? Speaking to The Spectator, the former Chancellor explained how he was alerted early to the fact that these all-important minutes were often had dissenting voices edited out, and said his official who sat in the meetings would tell him, well, actually, it turns out that lots of people disagreed with that conclusion. Here are the reasons that they were not sure about it. Now, that revelation has rightly been met with widespread fury, prompting barrister and legal commentator Francis Hoare to write of the former Chancellor's claim. This is absolutely shocking. If this is true, then those responsible, and it is reasonable to suppose that Whitty and Vallance were at least aware, should face a criminal investigation for misconduct in public office. So do you agree? Should the likes of Christopher Whitty and Patrick Vallance face criminal investigation in light of these allegations from Rishi Sunak? Let me know your thoughts. Email me, dan@gbnews.uk. Tweet me @gbnews. You can vote in our poll while you're there. The results coming up shortly. But here now, to argue his point further, is Francis Hoare himself and the fellow criminal barrister and former Tory MP, Jerry Hayes. Good evening, both. Francis Hoare, so can you just explain how a criminal investigation could happen based on what we know so far?
You'll have noticed, and it's important to make clear, that there were two caveats in that. First of all, if what Sunak said is true, that's obviously an important caveat, because we only have his word for it in a campaign in which he stands potentially to gain from this. Secondly, Whitty and Vallance were potentially involved. So what I'm not suggesting is that we target an investigation at two individuals. What I am saying is that we have evidence of a serious, what is a serious breach of trust, which is the manipulation of minutes to reject all alternative dissenting views. Now, there is very little guidance, it has to be said, on the making of minutes in Whitehall, but there is a 2001 document. And while the 2001 document says quite fairly that individuals are not necessarily named if they are dissenting and so on, one must expect accuracy in it. The reason why this is important, as you indicated, is because at the time, the minutes were not, first of all, they were not published, but they were made available to the government and to the cabinet. And it is reasonable to expect that the cabinet should be given an accurate view on scientific advice. They made up SAGE of a number of people from very many different disciplines, deliberately so that you could get a number of different views about that situation. As it happens, lockdown wasn't specifically advised by SAGE, even on the minutes, without the dissenting voices before lockdown was actually imposed. And that was clear when the minutes were eventually published after a judicial review in which I was counsel. They weren't published before that. That was in May. But nevertheless, when they were published, it seems that we didn't get a true and accurate provision. Now, Jerry will obviously come in a minute, but the ingredients of this offence are that a public officer is acting as a public officer. Anyone who's making the minutes most certainly will be. The question of whether they willfully neglect to perform their duty, well, the duty is, of course, making minutes and making them accurately, and then to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder. Now, I'm not, of course, prejudging what any investigation may discover, and I've already said that the caveat is if what Rishi Sunak said is true. But if it is true, I would suggest that at least it is justified to investigate it. People spoke about investigating the Prime Minister for this offence simply for hosting meetings in which he clearly wasn't acting as a public officer, because hosting a champagne breakfast or a birthday cake is clearly not him acting as a public officer. So that was a nonsense claim. But in addition to the claim against the Prime Minister, the suggestion he should face investigations for campaigning for Brexit, when, again, he wasn't acting as a public officer. But when people are taking minutes to go before the cabinet and then be published by the country for the country's purposes, they of course are acting as a public officer. So there can be no doubt about that. The question is whether or not there is misconduct and whether it is so severe that it arguably meets the test for prosecution. That's an open question, but one that should be investigated.
OK, you've set out your case well there, Francis Hoare. Jerry Hayes, surely if minutes from SAGE meetings were being edited to omit opposing opinions from the final draft, there should be a criminal investigation into why and how that happened.
Well, this is with respect to Francis. We're old friends. I remember when he was a pupil in Chambers doing criminal law, but I don't think you do criminal law at the moment. And there's no way you can stick on misconduct in public office. I'm not going to go into the law of it, but you really should know. It really is a nonsense. But what Rishi Sunak was saying, and the source of this story is in The Spectator. And I hope you've both read it, because he's not attacking Whitty Valance. Yeah. He's not attacking Whitty and Valance. He's not attacking lockdown. The real gripe he has is this was all taken over by Number 10. Number 10 was making all the decisions and weren't consulting the cabinet at all. What was happening in SAGE? SAGE is a big body. Sometimes there'll be 50, sometimes there'll be more. Scientists are very much like economists. They will disagree. But what they did, and the whole purpose of the minute taking was, and these are the words of Rishi Sunak, was to distill something for ministers to act on. Of course, there's going to be dissent. There's dissent in cabinet committees. There's dissent in cabinet, but you don't always make it public at the time, in the time of national crisis. The other big gripe that Sunak has is, one, he was being accused of complaining about schools, because I think this is a big mistake that was made. We shouldn't have closed down the schools at all. It has caused absolute disaster. That there was no modelling. In other words, the Treasury was asked to take decisions based on something which, was very much up in the air.
Well, of course. Of course, but that's what Francis and I have been saying for such a long time.
Sorry, go on. Sorry, Dan, I couldn't hear.
Well, that's the point, though. You're making the point. That's what Francis and I have been saying for such a long time. The damage caused by these lockdown decisions was criminal. And, I mean, Francis, look,
no, it's not criminal.
I think it was.
You could say just about every government decision is criminal if you disagree with it. Look, the definition of misconduct in public office: deliberately doing something which is wrong, knowing it is wrong, or with reckless indifference as to whether it was wrong or not. The defendant must know that a right-thinking member of the public to conclude that misconduct is so serious that it goes to the threshold test.
OK, well, that's the definition. So let me bring Francis in to say, Francis, do you think it potentially meets that threshold?
Well, I've just outlined. The point is, Jerry hasn't suggested that I've misrepresented or misstated what the test is. That is the test. It's a test for the jury. But first of all, it will be a test.
Your intro has been that Whitty and Valance should be indicted for misconduct in public office, which is nonsense and actually libelous.
No, Jerry, as you know, because you saw the tweet that was quoted, what I said is there is scope, there is cause to investigate whether or not officials were responsible. I didn't suggest that, as it happened in that tweet, that particular individuals should be. I said it is reasonable to suppose, thank you, Dan, to Whitty and Valance were at least aware. And that it is an open question as to whether or not they authorised those minutes.
It's not the definition of misconduct in public office. Being aware, being potentially aware, the question is not a criminal offence. You should know that.
Sorry, hang on a minute. The question is whether or not the public official is acting as such. We know that they were acting as a public official. The question is whether they willfully neglect to perform his duty. This is Attorney General's reference number 3 of 2003 for what it is worth.
And there's a 2015 case as well. But it's nonsense what you're saying.
Well, of course. And it is always a question for the jury, and it always is a question as to whether or not the conduct is so serious that it is, as you said, that it is a criminal in nature. And we don't know this. But if it is the case that there were officials in Sage, giving a clear and coherent alternative view. If it is the case that that was deliberately excised from minutes, it is at least a question mark as to whether or not that reaches the threshold.
Yes. And Jerry Hayes, given that we now know,
and the question can only be answered if an investigation investigates that. That's the
Francis,
point.
just hold for a second, Jerry. Given that we now know that these lockdowns potentially killed tens of thousands of people, they may end up, and I'm very confident they will end up killing more folk than people who actually died from the virus. Surely, at the very least, you want an investigation.
I'm sorry, that is just nonsense. And that ship has sailed.
How is it nonsense?
205 people died. 205,000 people died. But the
well, do you know how? Well, no, you've just said that what I've said is nonsense, Jerry. Do you have any idea how many people are going to die from missed cancer operations, from heart attacks at home, from strokes at home, from suicide, from alcohol addiction? No, at this point, you have no idea.
I have every idea, and that,
well, how many?
I agree with.
How do you know?
No. I was talking about I was talking about the criminal investigation. What you're saying is nonsense. Of course, it shouldn't be a criminal investigation. I'll tell you why. If it was behind closed doors, yeah, perhaps let's have a look at it. But there were representatives of departments there. There was a representative of the Treasury there. There was a representative of Number 10. There were several, in fact. There was a bit of a row at the time.
Yes, and we've got the second most powerful person in the country revealing that the minutes from Sage meetings were edited, which resulted in opposing opinions being omitted from the final draft. Francis Hoare, I'm going to give you the final word. Isn't it so shocking that Rishi Sunak has blown the whistle on this lockdown disgrace, and the vast majority of the mainstream media are completely ignoring this topic because they are in the tank for these lockdowns?
It's a non-story.
It's not a non-story. If you think it's a non-story, Jerry, then you've lost all your news sense altogether. Francis Hoare, final word.
Yes, and the point about these minutes is irrespective of whether this reaches the threshold of a criminal investigation, the more important question is that the public, when these minutes were published, were misled as to the extent of government advice in what is an unprecedented reaction to a pandemic that was contrary to all their pandemic plans and even the WHO's pandemic plans from October 2019. Yeah. Jerry and I agree, and I'm glad to hear him say this, that the closure of schools was a mistake, I would say, a deplorable mistake. And that was a contribution.
But it was a mistake that happened in part because of the way that Sage operated. But look, I'm glad that we are not a note of agreement. Thank you so much to public law barrister. Sorry, we're going to have to go now, Jerry. But public law barrister and legal commentator Francis Hoare and the former Tory MP and criminal barrister Jerry Hayes.